This week's reading deals a lot with information about the basics of understanding crisis intervention. One of the things I wanted to concentrate on a little bit was how we define a crisis. And I think it's important to point out that crisis does not necessarily have to lead to psychopathology or mental illness. Very often that assumption is made, and it's definitely a mistaken assumption. Some people really do very well in coping with crises, and some people, when we want to put a label on them, can sometimes feel like they have to live up to that label. So when we're talking about defining a crisis, a couple things we need to think about. So for example, there's different definitions for an individual and a system in crisis. So when we talk about those definitions, it's important to understand the environment. So for example, the definitions of an individual crisis, I think the main thing we need to think about when we look at this definition, that crisis is the perception of an event or situation that exceeds a person's own coping mechanisms. So some people might be able to cope very well with a situation. Those that are not able to, that's really when we're talking about the individual crisis. A behavioral emergency is when it really gets to the point where someone is in grave danger of injury or death. And then parasuicide, which sounds like a very odd definition, when a person intentionally places themselves in a position to be killed. I think most of the time when we hear about this in the media, we'll hear about, and we have to be careful how we phrase it, suicide by cop. Someone who is suicidal and not able to complete the act themselves, or they don't think they can, will sometimes put themselves in that position to be killed. In other words, let somebody else kind of do that for them. When we're also talking about definitions, it's important to look at the difference between a systemic crisis and a metastasizing crisis. So a systemic crisis is when a trauma event that really goes beyond what an institution, community, etc. are able to tolerate. And when we talk about unable to tolerate it, we're talking about being able to control the event. So some examples, I think, of systemic crisis that most of us have heard of, and it's probably mainly on our mind during this time of year because hurricane season is so common, is Hurricane Katrina that was in 2005. If you go back and look at the history of that event, and we see people in the Superdome who don't have food or fresh water, and the situation is just becoming intolerable for human survival. Another example of a systemic crisis might be when we talk about the hurricane that hit Puerto Rico, or a school shooting. Most recently, I think most of us have heard of Columbine, or again, most recently, Sandy Hook, and the school shooting there. Columbine does go back to 2005, and Sandy Hook to 2012. A metastasizing crisis occurs when a small isolated incident really gets out of hand, either because it's not handled well or because it's just not able to be handled by the system. So some different things we could think about when we're talking about a metastasizing crisis could be our COVID-19 pandemic. If we look back on it, how quickly it spread, how quickly it became a worldwide issue, and how it really changed our lives, our day-to-day lives during the worst of the pandemic when things were shut down, people weren't able to go to their businesses or places of work. So we think of that maybe more as a metastasizing crisis because it kept spreading and spreading. In the year 2021, we often ask ourselves, are we still in this pandemic crisis? And as of fall of 2021, I think we have to admit that we are. The pandemic continues to affect our day-to-day lives. Some important characteristics of crisis that we need to talk about is that a crisis can be dangerous because our psychological behavior can change and cause ourselves to hurt ourselves or cause us to hurt others. As odd as it seems, sometimes a crisis is the opportunity that we don't always recognize. It may force someone who needs help to seek help. When we think about people in addictions, we might think about someone who is quote unquote hitting bottom. The crisis has come up and put the person in a position where they have no choice really to seek help. And a lot of times too, we know with addictions that people don't go for help until they can actually admit that they don't have control of a problem. And another characteristic of a crisis is there's no quick fix. There's no way to just wave a magic wand and make the problem go away. Other characteristics of crisis that are important to remember, that choosing, the necessity of choice and deciding not to choose. That's a lot of times what our clients don't understand. Not making a decision is making a decision. So it is a choice. And very often the choice has negative results. And then the fact that crisis can be considered universal because no one's immune to them. And resiliency is huge. Very often people are more resilient than we think they are, or even they think they are. Some people really have that natural ability to move through a crisis and recover very quickly. And lastly, perception. Perception of an event is really the part that causes distress. And this explains to us why 5 different people can experience an event, and some have no real issues getting through it, where others, the perception is that they just can't handle the situation. And once they've made that decision that they can't handle it, that is really when that person goes into crisis, as opposed to the person who is resilient and finds a way to get through the problem. Some people are just better at that than others.